Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, a place where stories from long ago help carry you softly into sleep. Tonight, we'll be traveling back to the gentle hills of Tuscany to follow the life and dreams of a man whose imagination stretched far beyond his time. Tonight, we tell the story of Leonardo da Vinci. Let your thoughts drift like clouds over the rolling fields of Renaissance Italy. Let the hum of time settle around you. Let's begin. He was born on a quiet April night under a sky full of stars, in a world that had no idea what he would become. In the small hilltop village of Vinci, surrounded by olive trees that shimmered silver in the moonlight and fields that rolled like waves of green and gold, a baby came into the world, illegitimate, unnoticed by history for a moment, but destined to change the way we see everything. His name was Leonardo. And even though his birth passed without fanfare, something about that child seemed different, even then, as if the world had whispered a secret into his ear before he ever opened his eyes. Vinci was a place of stillness, a village untouched by the noise of empires or the rush of armies. It sat tucked away in the Tuscan hills, where stone cottages clustered close together like old friends, and cypress trees reached quietly into the sky. Life there was slow, honest, and steeped in tradition. Farmers rose with the sun, craftsmen worked with calloused hands, and the seasons passed in gentle rhythm. But amid this simple life was a boy who saw things differently. Leonardo's earliest years were filled with observation, silent, curious, watching. While other children played games in the dusty roads, he would crouch by a stream and watch how water bent around a rock, how light flickered on the surface, how dragonflies hovered in place, as if held by invisible threads. He noticed everything. He asked questions no one else thought to ask. Why did birds fly in arcs? Why did shadows change shape? Why did petals unfold the way they did? And no one, not even his teachers, could give him answers that satisfied his growing hunger to understand. His father, Ser Piero, was a notary, a man of education, but not emotion. He saw his son as clever, perhaps too clever, and too restless for the quiet, ordered life of an ordinary man. His mother, Caterina, a peasant girl, was not a part of his life for long, and so Leonardo grew up between homes, between classes, between expectations. He did not belong fully to any world, and in that space in between, he found freedom, a freedom to think, to imagine, to wander. The hills of Vinci became his playground and his classroom. He wandered barefoot through vineyards, gathered insects in glass jars, sketched leaves with bits of charcoal, and lay on his back in the grass for hours, watching the slow procession of clouds across the sky. He didn't know it yet, but even in these early wanderings, he was training his mind to see what others missed, to follow detail beyond the surface, to make sense of the infinite patterns woven into the world around him. The villagers thought him odd at times. He was quiet, often lost in thought, and always drawing, on slate, in the dirt, even on the walls of his home when he ran out of parchment. His sketches were strange, full of contraptions, birds with mechanical wings, wheels that turned themselves, creatures from dreams that seemed half real. But his fascination was never with fantasy. It was always with truth, truth as seen through the eyes of someone unafraid to look deeper. He studied animals and plants, watched storms roll over the distant mountains, traced the movement of ants across stones, fascinated by the order in their tiny chaos. Nature, to him, was a vast book, written in a language he was determined to learn. And as the years passed, that desire only grew. Leonardo became a boy with a restless soul and a mind that never slowed. He had no formal education in Greek or Latin like the sons of noblemen, but he taught himself in secret, absorbing whatever knowledge he could find. He read what few books he had access to. He copied diagrams of machines, studied the proportions of faces and bodies, and kept notes of everything, pages upon pages filled with thoughts, drawings, and inventions, all written backwards, in mirrored handwriting. No one is quite sure why he did this. Perhaps it was to keep his ideas secret, or perhaps it was simply because writing that way felt more natural to him. Whatever the reason, It became one of many mysteries about the boy from Vinci. And yet, even as his ideas bloomed in private, the outside world barely noticed. He was not a prodigy in the way others are remembered. He had no grand achievements as a child, no famous teachers, no moment of triumph. Just a boy, walking alone through olive groves, talking to himself in whispers, eyes scanning the horizon for questions that had no easy answers. But perhaps that is what makes his story even more remarkable, that genius could grow quietly, like a root beneath the soil, invisible to all, until it broke through the surface and changed the world above it. Leonardo da Vinci's childhood gave him more than time. It gave him solitude, a sacred space to become entirely himself. Without the pressure of expectation or the cage of tradition, he was free to explore the full range of his curiosity. And in that freedom, he began to build the foundation of a mind that would eventually touch every corner of human knowledge. It all began in Vinci. With the wind in the trees, the murmur of streams, the endless flight of birds above, and the quiet dreams of a boy who believed the world could always be more than it seemed. Florence, in the mid-15th century, was unlike any city in the world. It pulsed with art, philosophy, invention, and the hum of human genius. It was the beating heart of the Renaissance, where ideas were traded like coins, and every street corner held the echo of a poem or the whisper of a painting coming to life. Marble palaces and grand cathedrals stood beneath the same Tuscan sun that had warmed the hills of Vinci. But here, the world moved faster, brighter, deeper, and into this city of light came a young man with ink-stained fingers and a head full of dreams, barely more than a boy. Leonardo was around 14 years old when his father brought him to Florence, recognizing that his son's talent needed more than quiet fields and dusty village roads. It needed a forge, a workshop, a master. His father arranged for him to apprentice in the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio, a respected artist and craftsman whose workshop was one of the most vibrant in the city. It was not a quiet place. It buzzed with activity, filled with the scent of turpentine and metal, the clatter of chisels, and the murmur of students reciting geometry while they worked. Verrocchio's studio was not just a place to learn how to paint. It was a furnace of creativity, where sculpture, engineering, drawing, casting, architecture, and even theatrical design came together under one roof. To walk through its doors was to enter a world where imagination had tools, and dreams were carved into stone or brushed into color. For Leonardo, it was overwhelming at first. The city itself was a wonder, with its twisting streets and towering churches, with scholars debating in open courtyards and merchants discussing astronomy between coin counts. In Verrocchio's studio, he began at the bottom, grinding pigments, preparing canvases, cleaning tools. He studied the structure of the human form by sketching cadavers, just as he studied the delicate workings of gears and pulleys by helping to design mechanical stage sets. Every day was filled with learning: how to stretch a canvas, how to temper bronze, how to blend oil paints to make skin glow like it held breath beneath the surface. He was a student among many, but it didn't take long before people began to notice something different about him. There was a silence to his focus, a stillness behind the eyes, as though he was seeing things beyond what was in front of him. When he painted, it was with patience few could match. He didn't merely copy models. He tried to understand them, to grasp what made a face come alive, what made a gesture human. When he sculpted, he touched the clay like it might speak, if he listened long enough. His ideas, even in those early years, pushed the edge of what was known. While others repeated what they had been taught, Leonardo asked questions. Why do shadows fall as they do? How does the body balance itself in motion? What makes the smile of a person seem joyful or haunting? One of his earliest works to draw attention was his contribution to Verrocchio's painting The Baptism of Christ. It was a collaborative piece, as many workshop paintings were, with Verrocchio composing the overall image and assigning parts to his students. Leonardo was given a modest task, one of the angels kneeling beside Christ, but what he painted was not modest. His angel glowed with softness and life. its expression tender and complex, its hair curling with astonishing realism. The difference between Verrocchio's work and Leonardo's was so clear, so striking, that it became legend. Some say Verrocchio saw his student's gift and put down his brush forever, humbled by a talent he could not surpass. Whether or not that tale is true, the message it carried was, Leonardo had arrived. But he did not become famous overnight. His name was not yet whispered in noble courts or etched into the minds of kings. He remained, for a time, an apprentice. Still learning, still sketching, still wandering through Florence with his notebooks under his arm, scribbling ideas as he passed architectural marvels and sat beneath bridges to study the flow of the Arno River. He was fascinated by everything: light, water, anatomy, flight, perspective. He began to understand that painting was more than beauty. It was a science, a study of nature, of physics, of the mind. He believed that to paint well, you must first understand the very principles that shaped the world, the structure of the eye, the behavior of air, the rhythm of movement. His notebooks began to fill with studies not only of faces and figures, but of swirling water patterns, of machines he imagined and labeled, of mathematical diagrams he explored for no other reason than pure curiosity. While his fellow students refined their skills, Leonardo expanded his universe. He blended disciplines without hesitation: art and science, geometry and emotion, architecture and poetry. In his mind, there were no boundaries, only connections waiting to be discovered. As the years passed, he became more confident, more certain in his solitude. He was not drawn to the social life of Florence, though it surrounded him. He preferred the company of ideas. He wrote about the wind and how it curved around obstacles. He designed fantastical weapons and imagined flying machines based on the structure of bat wings. He explored optics, studying how lenses could bend and shape light. But still, he painted, because for all his scientific curiosity, Leonardo never abandoned beauty. He pursued it not as a surface, but as a truth that could only be captured by someone willing to look deeper than the eye could see. And so, within the stone walls of Verrocchio's workshop, with its cluttered tables and smoky light, Leonardo da Vinci transformed. The boy from Vinci became something else, not just an artist or an apprentice, but a mind in motion. Florence had given him more than tools and training. It had given him a mirror, a way to see the vastness of his own potential and the beginning of a path that would lead far beyond the city's gates. He would not stay there forever. But it was in Florence that the spark became a flame, and from that flame, the world would one day catch fire. It began not with a finished painting or a public commission, but with a question Leonardo could not stop asking. How does a bird lift itself into the sky? It seemed simple at first, but the deeper he looked, the more he realized no one truly understood. What allowed wings to generate lift? How did air behave beneath feathers? What forces kept a swallow gliding effortlessly over rooftops while human beings remained chained to the earth? This curiosity became a quiet obsession, and soon the margins of his sketchbooks began to fill with drawings of wings, long wings, short wings, curved wings, wings made of silk and wood and cord. Wings meant for man. It was not flight as fantasy that drew him in, but flight as an attainable puzzle. He was determined to solve it. Leonardo's mind worked in spirals, never in straight lines. From one question emerged many. How does air move? What is pressure? How does weight balance on a point? He became a student of forces. He watched leaves falling, not for their beauty, but for the patterns they drew in the air. He studied how smoke rose in columns and how birds adjusted the angle of their wings mid-flight. His notebooks turned into manuals of imaginary inventions, ornithopters with beating wings, parachutes shaped like pyramids, even a primitive helicopter powered by twisted ropes. He didn't just draw them, he annotated them in his neat mirrored script, calculating tensions, measuring ratios, imagining how each part might be built. Long before the principles of aerodynamics were known, Leonardo was sketching them in the flickering light of his study, trying to teach himself the language of the sky. But flight was only one doorway. The world around him offered an endless labyrinth of mysteries, and he wandered through them all with the patience of a monk and the hunger of a storm. He studied water next, its flow, its spirals, its sudden violence. He spent hours watching rivers and fountains, tracing how water curved around rocks, how it broke against barriers. He filled pages with vortices and eddies, arrows showing movement, diagrams of wave crests, and musings on erosion and pressure. To him, water was not just an element. It was a living thing, a force of transformation, capable of shaping the hardest stone over time. He saw it as a mirror of the human soul, restless, reflective, capable of both peace and destruction. His fascination with machines grew alongside these studies. Every tool he saw, he wanted to improve. He designed cranes with rotating arms, gears that lifted more than their size suggested, clockwork systems that counted hours with astonishing precision. He imagined a self-propelling cart, a forerunner to the automobile, and drew detailed blueprints for it, complete with a steering system and tension-controlled springs. He drew bridges that could be folded and carried by soldiers, ideal for quick crossings during war. He sketched massive war machines, multi-barreled cannons, armored vehicles with slanted sides to deflect enemy arrows, scythe-wheeled chariots that could tear through infantry. But Leonardo was not a man drawn to war. His imagination, though often filled with weapons, always hinted at reluctance. In the corners of his notes, he would sometimes add phrases in his flowing script: "War is best avoided," or "the destruction of life brings no glory." He understood human conflict, but he did not revere it. And yet, many of his designs were created under the patronage of powerful men, dukes, generals, princes, who saw in Leonardo's mind the potential to gain advantage. He offered them machines of defense and offense, knowing that such inventions were expected, even necessary. But privately, his notebooks turned again and again to healing, to harmony, to the deeper mechanics of nature. He studied the human body as though it, too, were a kind of machine, a system of pulleys and levers, powered by breath and blood. He dissected animals, later even humans, carefully opening muscles and tendons to understand their functions. He drew the heart, not as a symbol of love, but as a pump. He diagrammed the brain and nerves, traced the pathways of veins and arteries, recorded the way a finger bends or a shoulder rotates. To him, anatomy was not separate from art. It was the foundation of it. A good painter must know the bones beneath the skin, the way tension lived in muscle, how light slid across the curve of a rib cage. Every sketch he made served more than one purpose. It was both science and beauty. Leonardo's pursuit of knowledge was insatiable, but it was never chaotic. His mind did not rush, it wandered with discipline. Each question led logically to the next. He studied optics, building devices to understand how the eye perceives distance and depth. He experimented with light and shadow, learning how color changes in darkness, how reflections distort the truth. He studied geometry, not as abstract lines and angles, but as a way of interpreting space, proportion, and balance in all things, from a human face to the plan of a city. His interests folded into one another, like an infinite loop, where mathematics informed art, art informed engineering, engineering informed philosophy. He did not draw lines between disciplines, because he did not believe they were separate. Everything in the world, he believed, was connected by underlying principles, waiting to be discovered. Most of these studies he never shared publicly. The notebooks stayed private, their pages multiplying year after year, hundreds of sheets, thousands of drawings, countless notes. He stored them carefully, organized and indexed, as if he knew that someday someone might read them. But in his own lifetime, many of his ideas remained hidden. He was not driven by glory or wealth, though he would come to know both. He was driven by wonder, by the sense that the world was a book written in a language only the deeply curious could begin to understand. And even in the solitude of his studies, he never lost his sense of beauty. He saw elegance in everything, in the curve of a shell, in the pattern of seeds in a sunflower, in the spiral of galaxies and snail shells alike. He did not seek to dominate nature, only to learn from it, to borrow its wisdom and apply it gently to human thought. That, perhaps, was the true source of his genius, not the volume of his knowledge, but the way he gathered it, slowly, carefully, with reverence. He was not satisfied with what he knew. He was enchanted by what he did not. Each morning brought new questions, and each night he fell asleep surrounded by sketches of impossible machines and graceful wings and water flowing in eternal curls. His dreams were not fantasy. They were blueprints for a future the world had yet to imagine, and though most of his inventions would never be built in his lifetime, the pages remained, waiting, as if the ideas themselves had a patience equal to his own. To Leonardo, painting was not simply a craft or a means of decoration. It was a science of the soul, a language more precise than words, more expressive than music, more enduring than sculpture. It was through painting that he believed he could touch the divine. He once wrote that a painter is a lord of all things that man can know, because with a brush, he could recreate not only the appearance of the world, but its essence. And so, though his notebooks brimmed with machines and anatomical studies and notes on water and air, his heart always returned to the canvas. There, he could pour everything he had observed, everything he had questioned, into a single moment, frozen in time. What made his paintings different, what made them unforgettable, was not the subjects themselves, but how he revealed them. He painted not only with his eyes, but with the full weight of his mind and spirit. Every choice was deliberate, and every stroke was layered with intention. He studied light for years, not just how it shone, but how it scattered, how it reflected off smooth marble or diffused across rough cloth. He watched how shadows changed as the sun moved, how a face could be transformed by the smallest shift in light. He created a technique now known as sfumato, a soft, smoky blending of tones and edges that allowed forms to emerge with a ghost-like realism. There were no harsh lines in Leonardo's world, only transitions, only flows. He believed that nature did not create in outlines, and so neither would he. Among his early works, The Virgin of the Rocks marked a turning point. Painted in 2 versions across decades, it was unlike any religious scene the world had seen. The setting was a dark and mysterious grotto, filled with strange, jagged rocks and pools of deep water. The figures, Mary, the Christ child, an angel, and the infant John the Baptist, did not pose stiffly in golden halos. Instead, they interacted naturally, gently, as if caught mid-thought, mid-breath. The angel looked directly at the viewer, a faint smile on her lips, pointing toward John, while Mary's hand hovered protectively over Christ. Light filtered in from above, not as a holy glow, but as a whisper of nature, casting the scene in twilight. It was not a painting of perfection, it was a painting of mystery, of humanity, of divinity hidden within flesh and stone. Viewers who saw it were struck not only by its beauty, but by its silence. It felt alive, and yet dreamlike, like something remembered rather than seen. In The Lady with an Ermine, a portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, Leonardo again demonstrated his mastery of subtlety. Cecilia, the young mistress of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, is shown in profile, holding a small white ermine, but this is no mere portrait. Her eyes are turned to the side, as if someone has just entered the room. Her fingers wrap around the animal, not with stiffness, but with delicate tension, suggesting movement. The ermine, symbol of purity, and also a personal emblem of the Duke, is rendered with astonishing detail. Its fur, its tiny claws, its watchful gaze. Every element speaks to the sitter's intellect, her place in court, her hidden emotions. Leonardo painted not just her face, but her presence. She does not look at you, and yet you feel seen. But it was with the Last Supper that Leonardo reached a kind of sacred culmination. Commissioned for the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, the painting was to depict a moment every artist knew well, the moment Christ tells his disciples that one among them will betray him. But Leonardo, as always, approached it differently. He did not see 13 figures sitting solemnly in ritual. He saw a room full of tension, emotion, revelation. And so he painted that single second, just after Christ's words, just before the reaction settles. The disciples burst into motion. Each one reacts differently. Shock, denial, confusion, anger. Their hands reach out, their faces twist, their bodies lean toward or away from Christ. And yet in the center, Christ is still, a triangle of calm amid chaos. The lines of the walls, the windows, the perspective, all draw your eyes to him. The light from the open windows behind seems almost to radiate through him, not with drama, but with quiet inevitability. It is not just a painting of a meal, it is a painting of fate. Leonardo used experimental techniques on that wall, dry plaster instead of traditional fresco. He wanted more control, more time to refine, but the method was fragile. Within years, the painting began to deteriorate. Still, even in fragments, its power remains. For those who saw it in its early days, it was nothing short of a miracle, a painting that breathed, a scene that felt as if it were unfolding before their very eyes. Yet despite his fame, Leonardo did not rush to produce. He was slow, painstaking, and often left commissions unfinished. He could spend days mixing pigments or contemplating a background. He studied the veins of leaves before painting trees. He watched how laughter changed the muscles of the face before painting a smile. Many of his works were never completed. Others were started and then abandoned, replaced by new fascinations. But what he did finish, no matter how few, carried more depth than most artists produced in a lifetime. To Leonardo, painting was never about decoration. It was an act of understanding. It was where the mysteries of the world were brought into form. A human face, to him, was not just features, but a map of thought and spirit. A hand was not just a shape, but a miracle of motion and design. In every line, he asked a question. In every shadow, he offered an answer. His paintings were not meant to impress. They were meant to reveal. And perhaps that is why, even now, centuries later, they continue to hold us, not because of their fame or their history, but because they contain something deeper, something quiet, something true. In their stillness, they speak. They whisper of a man who believed the visible world was only the surface, and that beneath it lay an ocean of wonder. A man who, with each brushstroke, tried to bring us just a little closer to understanding what it means to be alive. There came a time when Leonardo's fascination with the visible world turned inward, not away from beauty, but deeper into its core, beneath the skin, beneath the flesh, to the hidden architecture that made all movement, all grace, all life possible. He had painted bodies with a precision that captured breath, expressions that lived between words, gestures that seemed to speak. But he began to realize that to truly paint the body, to truly understand its rhythm, he needed to go beyond surface observation. He needed to see how it worked from within. And so began one of the most remarkable, haunting, and illuminating chapters of his life, his study of anatomy. At first, it was driven by artistic curiosity. He wanted to understand the movement of the neck, the fold of the arm, the way a smile tugged at the corners of the mouth. But the deeper he explored, the more it became clear that anatomy was not just a tool for painting. It was a language, a living map, a divine design of which every person was a walking miracle. In the quiet hours of night, with a candle flickering at his elbow and silence all around him, Leonardo performed dissections, first on animals, later on the bodies of men and women, sometimes even children, donated by hospitals or, in some cases, taken from the margins of society, unclaimed, unknown. What he saw did not repulse him. It awed him. He dissected carefully, methodically, like an explorer, mapping an undiscovered continent. He took notes in mirror script, so densely packed with information and surrounded by drawings that a single page could contain more insight than entire volumes written by physicians of his day. He drew the bones first, their interlocking structures, the way the spine curled like a coiled serpent, the slope of the pelvis, the precision of the joints. Then came the muscles, each one layered, each one responsible for a different movement. He traced tendons from origin to insertion, showing how they pulled on bones to make the arm rise, the hand grip, the leg lift. He labeled every part, not in the Latin of scholars, but in his own Italian tongue, because knowledge, he believed, should not belong only to the learned. It should belong to anyone who sought to understand. But Leonardo did not stop at the mechanical. He studied the organs, the liver, the lungs, the intestines, with the same reverence. He observed how the heart contracted, theorized how the blood flowed, even sketched the 4 chambers of the heart with astonishing accuracy centuries before medical science confirmed his observations. He wrote about the aortic valve, about how it opened and closed, about how blood must move in a circuit. He believed that the heart was a pump, not the mystical seat of emotion that others imagined, but a powerful, intelligent machine designed for continuous motion. He was not far from the truth. Then there was the brain. He dissected skulls, removed the brain tissue, traced the nerves leading from the eye to the brain, and from the brain to the rest of the body. He was fascinated by sensation, how we see, how we feel, how we think. He sketched the eye with the same precision he used for cathedrals, exploring the curvature of the lens, the nature of perspective, the illusion of depth. He wondered aloud whether the soul resided somewhere in the ventricles of the brain, or perhaps in the pineal gland, not out of superstition, but from a desire to locate the bridge between flesh and thought. His studies of the fetus in the womb are among the most tender and moving of his works. He drew unborn children curled gently within their mothers, surrounded by the soft web of the uterus and the umbilical cord. These were not clinical images. They were intimate, full of awe. In his notes, he speculated about how life begins, how a child is nourished before birth, how breath awakens. He saw creation not as myth but as miracle, carried out in silence, hidden from the world until its moment arrived, and still, he recorded it, hoping one day others would understand what he had seen. These anatomical notebooks remained unpublished during his lifetime. They were too radical, too detailed, too ahead of their time. Medicine in his day still leaned on ancient texts, many of them filled with error, unchallenged for centuries. But Leonardo challenged everything. He trusted his eyes above all. He wrote that experience was the true master, that what one observed was greater than what one had been told. And so, he continued, even as old age approached, even as his hands grew slower, even as his body began to show the very systems he had studied for so long. He dissected over 30 bodies, drawing more than 240 detailed plates, creating what would have been, had they been printed, the most comprehensive anatomy textbook the world had ever seen. But Leonardo did not seek to become a doctor. He was not after a medical legacy. He studied anatomy because he believed that to understand the human body was to understand nature's masterpiece. Every muscle, every bone, every ligament was crafted with purpose. To him, it was proof of a vast intelligence within the universe, not bound by religion or doctrine, but expressed in form and function. He wrote of the body as a machine, of exquisite design, and he treated it with the same reverence he gave to art or architecture. And still, even with all this knowledge, he remained humble. In his notes, he confessed how little he truly knew, how much remained hidden. He marveled at how much more there was to learn, always more, always beyond reach. The more he uncovered, the more mystery seemed to unfold. But this, to Leonardo, was not discouragement. It was the reason to keep going. He carried this knowledge with him into every painting. When he painted a hand, it was not guesswork. It was built from memory, from the inside out. When he painted a smile, he understood the tiny muscles that pulled each corner of the mouth. When he painted a figure in motion, he knew how the spine twisted, how the ribcage lifted with breath, how balance shifted through the legs and feet. His art was inseparable from his science. And his science was never cold. It was always driven by wonder. Even now, centuries later, many of his anatomical discoveries remain stunning. His notes on the spine, the heart, the muscles of the face, some are so accurate they've been used in medical schools. But he did not have to be a surgeon to change medicine. He only had to look deeply, carefully, patiently, without fear. He only had to ask questions no one else thought to ask. And in that way, as in so many others, Leonardo da Vinci stepped beyond the borders of his time. He entered the body not to conquer it, but to listen to it, to understand the quiet, complex machinery of life, and in doing so, he gave the world not only knowledge, but reverence for the miracle of being human. Leonardo da Vinci, despite his brilliance, carried with him a quiet frustration that followed him from one city to the next, from one commission to another, from one burst of genius to long stretches of silence and indecision. His was a mind that could never rest, never be fully satisfied, never find comfort in a single answer or a completed task. He was, in many ways, a man out of step with the world around him, not because he lacked ability, but because he had too much of it, and it pulled him in too many directions at once. For every painting he finished, there were two he abandoned. For every invention he sketched, there were a dozen he never built. Even in his most celebrated moments, Leonardo remained haunted by the sense that his best ideas were just beyond his reach, that no single project could hold the full weight of his imagination. He often spoke of perfection, but not as something to attain, more as something to chase, knowing it would always be one step ahead. This pursuit led him to begin and then leave behind some of the most ambitious artistic and scientific efforts of the Renaissance. He would be commissioned to paint a great altarpiece or design a monument, and for a time he would immerse himself fully, drawing studies, testing materials, refining compositions. But then, something in his mind would shift. Another idea would rise, quietly at first, then louder, more urgent, a new concept, a new question, a better approach. And the project he had once poured himself into would suddenly seem incomplete, unworthy, or simply not enough. He would move on, chasing the next spark, leaving behind unfinished brilliance. One of the most famous examples of this pattern was the grand equestrian statue he was commissioned to create in Milan, a monument to Francesco Sforza, father of his patron, Ludovico. The statue was meant to be enormous, over 7 meters tall, a masterpiece in bronze that would stand as a symbol of the Sforza dynasty's strength and sophistication. Leonardo threw himself into the project with all the fire of his ambition. He studied horses obsessively, filling his notebooks with anatomical sketches, watching them gallop, rear, and trot, trying to capture the exact dynamics of their motion. He built clay models, worked out engineering problems, and designed complex molds for casting. The scale of the statue had never been attempted before, and the challenge thrilled him. After years of preparation, he finally unveiled a full-size clay model of the horse, and it stunned the court. People came from across the city to see it. There was talk of genius, of history being made. But before the final bronze could be cast, war broke out. The French invaded Milan, and the bronze set aside for the statue was melted down to make cannons. Leonardo's horse was never completed. The clay model was left standing in the open, exposed to rain and wind, until soldiers used it for target practice, reducing it to rubble. All that remained were his drawings and his dreams. Yet even when fate was not to blame, Leonardo's own restlessness often stood in the way of completion. He would begin a portrait and spend months perfecting a single hand, a fold of fabric, the turn of an eye. He was fascinated by the process, by the unfolding of form and meaning, but he seemed less interested in the end result. He once described painting as a thing never finished, only abandoned. To others, it was maddening. Patrons grew impatient, projects fell through, and Leonardo's reputation became one of both awe and unreliability. He was respected, adored, but also feared by those who depended on timetables and outcomes. His genius was undeniable, but it was unpredictable, untamable. And yet, in his so-called failures, there was a strange kind of triumph, because even what he left unfinished had a kind of resonance, a richness that inspired others. His drawings, studies of anatomy, architecture, mechanics, movement, were works of art in themselves. His designs for inventions that were never built, helicopters, diving suits, multi-barreled cannons, and more, spoke not of loss, but of possibility. They were glimpses into a future that had not yet arrived. His incomplete paintings, even those left only in sketch form, carried a spark that others recognized and followed. Artists studied his unfinished work the way poets read half-written verses, sensing in the lines what could have been, what still might be. Leonardo's inability to finish was not laziness or weakness. It was a reflection of how deeply he felt the weight of creation. He could not bring himself to declare something complete if he sensed even the slightest imperfection. He saw the flaws others missed, the missed opportunities, the better version that remained just out of sight. He would return to the same canvas years later, adjusting a shadow, softening a curve, refining the light. In some cases, he carried a painting with him from city to city, unable to let it go, unwilling to call it done. He painted not to produce, but to understand. And once he had learned all he could from a work, his heart moved on, even if his hand had not yet finished the frame. This restlessness extended to every area of his life. He was always in motion, always traveling between cities, always seeking new patrons, new landscapes, new minds to engage with. He was friendly and charismatic, but deeply private. He preferred the company of students and notebooks to the courtly life he was often surrounded by. He was difficult to categorize, impossible to predict. One day, he might be designing a festival for a duke, complete with moving sets and artificial clouds, and the next, he would disappear for weeks, wandering the countryside, sketching birds in flight, or the twisting forms of tree branches. He was drawn to complexity, and when things became too familiar, too defined, he withdrew. His world was one of fluid thought, and permanence was not his goal. In time, Leonardo became known, not just for his works, but for the force of his mind. People came to him, not only for art, but for ideas, for problems in architecture, for advice on engineering, for insight into fortifications and urban planning. He consulted on canals, bridges, and machines. He drafted blueprints for cities that never existed, full of flowing streets, sewage systems, and layered walkways. He dreamed of a better world, one that functioned more gracefully, more efficiently. But again and again, these projects remained on paper, grand visions, never realized. And perhaps, in the end, this was his truest nature, not as a man of production, but as a man of potential, a spark that lit 1,000 lamps, even if he didn't hold them all to completion. His mind was a cathedral under construction, pillars in place, scaffolding rising, but the roof always being lifted higher by imagination. He did not measure his life by what he had finished, but by what he had begun, and in that, he left behind something more enduring than any monument, a legacy, not of completion, but of endless curiosity. An unfinished genius whose greatest masterpiece may have been the permission he gave to others, to wonder, to reach, and to begin again. By the time Leonardo da Vinci entered the service of Ludovico Sforza, the powerful Duke of Milan, he was no longer just a promising young artist or an eccentric inventor. He had become something stranger, something the courts of Renaissance Italy did not quite know how to define. He was not a soldier, though he designed weapons. He was not a scholar, though his notebooks brimmed with theories. He was not a priest, yet he probed the mysteries of creation more deeply than most theologians. What Leonardo offered the court of Milan was not a simple skill, but a way of thinking, a mind that could shape festivals, fortresses, machines, and masterpieces alike. And Ludovico, eager to cultivate a court that rivaled those of Florence and Venice in both grandeur and intellect, welcomed him not just as an artist, but as a kind of magician of ideas. Leonardo arrived in Milan bearing a letter unlike any other. It was not a humble plea for work, nor a list of completed commissions, but a strange and confident manifesto. In it, he described not his paintings or sculptures, but his capabilities as a military engineer. He promised designs for bridges, siege engines, and fortifications, weapons of offense and defense, clever machines that would shift the balance of power. Only at the end, as if it were an afterthought, did he mention that he could also paint. This letter was not just a pitch, it was a declaration that he could shape a new world, if only given the space and the trust to do so. Ludovico, ever ambitious and intrigued by Leonardo's reputation, accepted. In Milan, Leonardo entered a new phase of life. He was no longer a wandering artist or unanchored thinker. He became part of a court, and with that came responsibilities, not just to create, but to entertain, to design, to solve problems. He was asked to plan pageants, to craft elaborate costumes and stage sets for theatrical performances. These were no ordinary entertainments. Leonardo turned each into a spectacle, combining music, light, moving machinery, and illusion. He designed artificial heavens that opened mid-performance to release stars and gods. He built dragons that breathed fire, clouds that floated, machines that moved dancers through the air, as if in flight. He understood drama, not just as story, but as experience, a way to awaken wonder, to create worlds within walls. But even as he worked on these spectacles, he never stopped drawing. His notebooks from these years are filled with studies of knots and braids, weapons and water wheels, flowers and flying machines. He sketched spiral staircases and irrigation systems, dome structures and musical instruments. He was equally at home, designing a new kind of mill as he was sculpting a model for a monument. Every problem was a puzzle, and every puzzle was a chance to see more deeply into the workings of nature and invention. The greatest of these Milanese dreams was the colossal equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father. Leonardo envisioned a sculpture of unprecedented size and elegance, a rearing horse frozen in bronze, a warrior prince mounted atop, a celebration of the Sforza family's might and legacy. He studied horses obsessively, watching them in the stables, measuring every muscle, every tendon, every nuance of motion. He sketched dozens of prototypes, from gentle grazing poses to explosive leaps. The challenge was not just artistic but engineering, how to cast something so massive, how to balance the weight on two legs, how to transport and assemble such a monument. Leonardo built a full-scale clay model, a triumph of form and presence, which stood in Milan like a promise of greatness. But then, the winds of history shifted. War broke out. The French army advanced on Milan, and Ludovico's reign began to crumble. The bronze Leonardo had waited for, carefully measured and requested, was melted down to forge cannons instead. The clay horse, magnificent but vulnerable, was left exposed. Soldiers used it for target practice. Years of work collapsed into ruin, and once again, Leonardo's vision, so nearly realized, vanished. As the court fell into disarray, Leonardo remained for a time in Milan, a quiet presence amid chaos. He continued to work, not for power or prestige, but because his mind did not know how to stop. Even in the shadow of political collapse, he painted. It was during this period that he began what would become one of his most enduring and mysterious works, the portrait of a young woman named Cecilia Gallerani, known today as Lady with an Ermine. The painting captures not just beauty, but presence. Cecilia turns her gaze with awareness, as though she hears a voice outside the frame. The ermine in her arms, sleek and coiled with alertness, echoes her tension. It was not merely a portrait, it was a glimpse into thought. Leonardo also continued his studies in science and engineering. He designed water systems to irrigate dry fields, bridges that could be assembled in hours, fortresses built to repel new forms of attack. But these projects, like many of his dreams, remained on paper. The world around him was shifting too quickly. The ideals of the Renaissance were beginning to show their fragility under the weight of war and ambition. Milan, once a place of vision and culture, became a battlefield. When Ludovico was finally overthrown and imprisoned, Leonardo fled. He left behind many unfinished works, countless sketches, and dreams that had no place in a world turned toward violence. But he did not leave empty-handed. He took with him his notebooks, his tools, and most importantly, his experience. Milan had tested him. It had shown him that ideas, no matter how grand, lived at the mercy of politics and war. It had taught him that beauty could be crushed, that vision could be silenced. But it had also proven that the mind, the searching, restless, burning mind, could endure. In the years that followed, Leonardo would move often, sometimes as a guest of kings, sometimes as a traveler without a fixed home. But the memory of Milan stayed with him. It was in that city that he had first been treated as more than a painter. It was in that court that his notebooks had overflowed with ambition, where he had tried to marry the practical with the poetic, the mechanical with the miraculous. Milan had offered him a glimpse of what might be possible when genius met opportunity. Even though much of what he planned there remained unbuilt or unfinished, the ideas themselves lived on. And for Leonardo, ideas were the true monuments, not bronze, not stone, not applause, but thought, pure, dangerous, beautiful thought, etched onto paper, carried in the mind, passed on like flame. He had given Milan his brilliance. And Milan, for a brief moment, had given him the stage he had always imagined. Though it did not last, though the statue crumbled and the court fell, something had been created that could not be unmade. A vision of what art, science, and invention could be when they worked together. A dream that would echo long after the halls had gone silent. It began as a commission, like many others before it. A Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo wanted a portrait of his wife, Lisa. She was a noblewoman by marriage, refined but not royal, poised but not famous, and the request was modest, just a likeness, something dignified to hang in their home. And yet, what Leonardo painted would become something far more enigmatic, far more enduring than anyone could have imagined. A woman seated calmly, her hands folded, her expression unreadable, her eyes following you no matter where you stand. The Mona Lisa, or, as Leonardo would have known her, Lisa Gherardini. A name he never inscribed on the canvas, a face he never explained, a mystery he never let go of. At first glance, the painting seems simple, muted colors, a quiet landscape, a restrained pose, but nothing about it is simple. Leonardo had studied human expression for decades. He had dissected the muscles of the face, watched the way laughter lifted the cheeks, the way sorrow darkened the eyes. He knew how the slightest shift of a muscle could change the entire emotion of a face, and in Lisa's smile, he poured everything he knew. It is not a full smile, nor a neutral line. It curves gently, ambiguously. At times it seems amused, at times reflective. In one moment, it invites you in the next, it keeps its secrets. And the more you look, the less certain you become. It is a smile that flickers, a light that comes and goes, a moment caught between thoughts. Leonardo used his technique of sfumato to perfection in this painting. There are no hard outlines. Everything softens at the edges, transitions gently from light to dark. Her skin glows with warmth and softness, almost translucent. The folds of her dress blend into one another like mist. The background, a surreal landscape of winding rivers and fantastical mountains, is rendered in pale blues and greys, fading into dream. It's not a real place, or perhaps it is a memory of one, or a reflection of the inner world of the sitter. Whatever it is, it feels otherworldly, a place just out of reach. The light in the painting is gentle, diffused, as if time itself has slowed. There is no jewelry, no elaborate dress, no obvious sign of status. Lisa's beauty is not adorned, it is inherent. Her gaze is direct, but not challenging. Her presence is still, but not passive. She looks at you with the calm of someone who knows more than she says, and perhaps she did. Or perhaps Leonardo gave her that wisdom himself, projecting onto her the quiet intelligence and inner life that he valued above all. But what makes this painting even more fascinating is not just what's there, but what it became. Leonardo never delivered the portrait to the Giocondo family. For reasons that remain unclear, he kept it. He carried it with him from city to city, through his travels in Florence, Through his final years in France, the painting was always close. He touched it again and again, refining, adjusting, never declaring it finished. It became a companion of sorts, a private obsession. Some believe he saw something divine in it, something that went beyond a single woman. Others say he saw himself in it, a reflection of his own contradictions, his own ambiguity, his own longing for clarity in a world that refused to reveal its final meaning. There are theories, of course, that the Mona Lisa is an idealized vision of womanhood, that it's a self-portrait in disguise, that it's an alchemical symbol or a code, that the background mirrors the left and right hemispheres of the brain, that her expression represents the dual nature of being, joy and melancholy, serenity and mystery. But Leonardo never explained, and perhaps that was the point. The painting was never meant to tell you what to think. It was meant to make you wonder, to hold you in a state of thoughtful suspension, the way Leonardo himself lived every day of his life. He once wrote that the eye is the window to the soul, and in Mona Lisa, he gave us two: eyes that do not blink, that do not judge, that simply see. In that way, she is less a person and more a mirror. She reflects your thoughts back to you. The longer you look, the more she seems to change, not because she does, but because you do. And yet, behind the serenity of the image lies the depth of Leonardo's process. He painted her slowly, obsessively. He would spend hours perfecting a single shadow. He studied human anatomy to understand the curves of her hands. He built mechanical devices to grind pigments more finely, to mix paints that would last. He layered the paint in glazes so thin, so delicate, that light passes through them still, 5 centuries later. He used no outlines, no tricks, just patience and presence. And above all, the refusal to accept the ordinary. What he created was not just a painting, but an experience, a conversation, a puzzle with no solution, a moment of perfect stillness inside the chaos of time. And he knew what he had done. Perhaps that is why he never let it go, not because it was unfinished in the way so many of his other works were, but because it was the closest he had come to painting thought itself. That mysterious, flickering place between idea and feeling, between silence and speech, between certainty and doubt. Even in his final years, when his health began to decline, when his hands were slower, when his travels ended, and he settled at last in the Loire Valley of France, he kept the Mona Lisa near. He would study her quietly, as though she might one day speak. But she never did. She remained exactly as she was, unchanged, eternal, full of silence. After Leonardo's death, the painting passed through royal hands, moved across borders, survived revolutions and theft, until it found its home behind glass in the Louvre. But the story does not end there. Every day, thousands of people stand before her. Some smile, some stare, some weep, and none of them see exactly the same thing. That is her gift. That is Leonardo's triumph. A single woman, seated calmly in a chair, has become the most recognized, most studied, most visited work of art in the world. And yet, she remains unknowable. In her silence, she speaks to something deeper, the part of us that seeks understanding, but knows it may never arrive. She reminds us that some things are meant not to be solved, but to be experienced. And that mystery, when held with reverence, can be the most powerful kind of truth. For Leonardo, who spent his life chasing the unseen forces behind beauty, motion, and thought, the Mona Lisa was not an end. It was a continuation, a still point in a turning world, a question, quietly waiting. The final chapter of Leonardo da Vinci's life began, not in Florence, not in Milan, but in the soft, green valleys of France, far from the hills of his youth, far from the cities where his masterpieces had been born. He arrived as an honored guest of the French king, Francis I, who had long admired him from afar and now, in the twilight of Leonardo's life, wished to bring the aging genius to his court, not as a laborer, not as a painter for hire, but as a treasure, a living library of wisdom, a friend. In 1516, Leonardo crossed the Alps, his belongings carefully packed, a Among them, the mysterious portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, which he had still not given away, still not declared finished, still carried like a secret close to the heart. Along with it came his notebooks, his sketches, his instruments, and the quiet awareness that he was nearing the end of his journey. He settled in a small manor house, known as Clos Lucé, nestled just a short walk from the king's own chateau in Amboise. It was a place of peace, shaded by old trees, surrounded by gardens and winding paths. Here, he found the rare gift of stillness, no longer pulled in a dozen directions by impatient patrons or shifting political powers. Leonardo was finally free to move at the pace of his own thoughts. Though his right hand had grown weak, likely from a stroke, and he could no longer paint as he once had, his mind remained alert, brilliant, restless. He spent his days reading, dictating notes, revisiting old ideas, and watching the world move around him with the same quiet wonder he had known as a boy in Vinci. Francis I visited often, not as a monarch demanding service, but as a companion fascinated by the mind of a man who had seen so much. They spoke of architecture and engineering, of philosophy and flight, of the shape of the cosmos and the intricacies of human invention. The king, still young and full of ambition, saw in Leonardo not just a master of the past, but a guide toward the future. Their conversations, though never recorded in full, were said to last for hours. They walked the grounds together, strolled by the river, spoke beneath the stars. Francis often called Leonardo "my father," a gesture of deep respect, and one that Leonardo, long used to being misunderstood or left behind, surely treasured. But the days passed quietly, and Leonardo, always aware of the finite nature of time, turned inward more often. He reviewed the drawings he had made in earlier years, his studies of the human heart, his designs for bridges, machines, cities. He knew how much of his work had never been realized, how many inventions remained locked in sketches, how many paintings had never been completed, but he did not despair. Instead, he gathered his notes, organized them, refined them, preparing them not for fame, but for the possibility that someone, someday, might pick them up and understand. His final years became an act of quiet preservation, passing on what he had learned, in hopes that the knowledge would outlive him. He reflected often, it's believed, on the nature of life, on the connection between all things. He had studied the body, the stars, the weather, the currents of water, the flight of birds, and in each of these, he saw patterns, he saw balance, design, unity. Even as his own body grew frail, he never stopped seeing the miracle of life in motion. He once wrote that the average human looks without seeing, listens without hearing, touches without feeling. But he had spent his life doing the opposite, seeing deeply, listening closely, feeling the world with such intensity that it shaped every brushstroke, every invention, every page of mirrored text he left behind. There were quiet moments, too. He tended to his garden, sat for long periods in the shade, observed the slow change of the seasons. He watched the light as it fell across stone walls, studied the pattern of leaves moving in the wind. Those who lived with him during those years said he spoke less often than he used to, but when he did, his words came slowly, thoughtfully, like a man translating his thoughts from a language only he fully understood. He was not sad, they said, only contemplative. He had done what he could. He had followed the thread of his curiosity through every corner of existence, and now, at the end, he was watching the world with the same eyes he had first opened beneath the skies of Vinci, eyes filled not with regret, but with reverence. On May 20, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died in his bed at Clos Lucé. According to tradition, King Francis was at his side, though history is uncertain. But what matters more than who was present was what remained when Leonardo left. Not gold, not titles, not power, but pages, thousands of them. Drawings of machines yet to be built, studies of faces no one else had noticed, dissections of plants and animals, and the inner workings of the body. notes on flight and light and laughter and sorrow. And paintings, few in number, but infinite in impact. A woman who smiles without revealing her secret. A dinner interrupted by betrayal. A young girl holding an ermine like a whisper of innocence. Each work a window into a mind that never stopped reaching. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Hubert, near the castle where he had spent his final years. His grave was marked, but time, as it always does, wore away the stone. Today, visitors still walk those grounds, seeking the place where the great master rests. But the truth is, Leonardo never truly stayed in one place. His legacy floats, like pollen in spring air, through every discipline he touched. Engineers still marvel at his machines. Scientists still examine his notes. Artists still learn from his gaze. And dreamers, perhaps most of all, still look to him as a patron of possibility. Leonardo da Vinci did not simply live in the Renaissance. He was the Renaissance, its promise, its hunger for knowledge, its blending of art and science, spirit and form, intuition and reason. He lived with questions rather than answers. He walked into every room not to teach, but to learn. And in the end, what he left behind was more than drawings and discoveries. He left behind an invitation to wonder, to observe, to imagine, to begin again. Centuries have passed since Leonardo da Vinci walked the earth, since he held a brush, turned the pages of his notebooks, sketched the gears of a machine that would never be built, or stared at the curve of a leaf until it yielded its secrets. And yet, even now, his presence has not faded. If anything, it has grown. His name endures not merely because of what he accomplished, but because of the way he thought, boundlessly, endlessly, restlessly. His legacy is not etched into a single statue or painting, not contained in one city or one discipline, but scattered across time like fragments of stardust. It lives in the laboratories of scientists who study the human body, in the halls of art schools where students still learn from the delicate balance of light and form in his paintings, in the minds of inventors who try to see beyond the limits of the present moment and imagine the world not as it is, but as it could be. What makes Leonardo so extraordinary is not that he was ahead of his time, but that he seemed to exist outside of time. He was not limited by the thinking of his era. He broke through it. He dared to ask questions that had no answers, dared to see connections that others had never noticed, dared to abandon the comfortable certainty of specialization in favor of an all-consuming curiosity. He painted and dissected, designed cathedrals and studied hydrodynamics, wrote music and theorized on the nature of light. He was not content with being merely an artist or an engineer or a scientist. He was all of them and more, and in doing so, he redefined what it meant to be human, not a creature bound by function, but a being of potential, of vision, of boundless seeking. Today, when we speak of Leonardo, we often reduce him to symbols: the Mona Lisa, the Vitruvian Man, the idea of the Renaissance man. But to reduce him is to miss the truth. He was not a symbol. He was a soul in motion, a man who lived not for fame or wealth, but for the act of wondering. He saw knowledge not as a destination, but as a path, one to walk slowly, mindfully, over a lifetime. His notebooks, filled with backwards writing and scattered diagrams, are not artifacts of brilliance so much as maps of a journey. They show not a finished product, but a process. A man thinking on the page, trying to understand the breath of a horse, the motion of a bird, the way blood moves through the heart. They are fragments of a mind reaching towards something larger than itself. And perhaps this is why Leonardo continues to speak to us, not just to scholars or artists, but to anyone who has ever paused to wonder how the world works. In every sketch of a curled fern, in every machine that mimics the flight of a bat, in every face rendered with such care that it seems ready to speak, he reminds us that curiosity is sacred, that the act of looking closely, of asking why, of following a question into the unknown, is itself an art form. His life teaches that there is no division between the technical and the beautiful, no boundary between the practical and the poetic. He invites us to live wide awake, to observe, to imagine, to never stop learning. And yet, for all his accomplishments, Leonardo often spoke of what he had not done. He wrote near the end of his life that he had offended God and mankind because he had not worked at his art as he should have. Such a statement seems almost impossible, coming from the man who gave the world some of its most beloved and studied creations. But it reveals something essential about him, a humility rooted not in self-doubt, but in the endless horizon of possibility. He knew, more deeply than anyone, how much there still was to know, and that knowledge, that there is always more to learn, was both his burden and his gift. We live in a world now filled with speed, distraction, and division, but Leonardo offers a different rhythm, a quieter one, a life lived not in fragments but in layers. He reminds us to slow down, to observe the texture of a leaf, the way shadow bends across stone, the silence between two notes of music. He reminds us that it is okay not to finish, that the pursuit itself holds its own kind of beauty, that greatness lies not in accumulation, but in attention, in classrooms, in museums, in libraries, in workshops, in dreams. His spirit remains. Children draw with wonder, not knowing they are sketching like he once did. Engineers build bridges, not knowing they echo his designs. Doctors study anatomy, unknowingly tracing his lines. And in every person who asks, "What if?" instead of "What is?" in every person who dares to follow a strange idea into the unknown, Leonardo lives again, not as a figure from the past, but as a force in the present. His story is not over. It cannot be, because stories like his do not end. They stretch forward into each mind brave enough to wonder, each hand steady enough to draw, each heart quiet enough to listen. Leonardo da Vinci left the world centuries ago, but he never left us. He is not only a chapter in history, he is a reminder, etched in ink and shadow, in smile and silence, that the human mind, when unchained, is a miracle, and that perhaps the greatest thing we can ever do is to look up, like he once did, at the flight of a bird, and say, not with certainty, but with awe, "How does it work?" And then, without needing to know the answer, begin.